The year is 2026. The memory shortage is in full swing. Components that could have gone to consumers are instead diverted to data centers to generate Harry Potter Balenciaga videos. PC builders are now resorting to installing Windows on hard drives. DDR4 RAM has become so expensive and rare that switching to console almost sounds like a good idea. And as far as DDR5 goes, well, some people have never even seen it in person, so who knows, maybe it never even existed in the first place. With no end to this shortage in sight, it is truly a dark time for anyone who wants to build a computer without selling their internal organs to pay for it. Luckily, all of that doesn't matter to me because I'm building a DDR3 computer. I still have this i7-2600 from a previous video that I need to do something with, and so here we are. Alright, let's take a look at the components that I've got for this build. Like I said, I am going to be using an Intel i7-2600 for the processor. It's a pretty decent CPU, 4 cores and 8 threads, which turbo up to 3.8 GHz. It's also a 95 watt TDP CPU, which is the problem that I ran into with my previous build with this processor. I had this thing in a very cramped case under a stock cooler, and the power supply I was using was only 180 watts. And when you combined it with this processor, the whole case basically turned into an inferno. This thing cost me 800 Ukrainian pesos or $20, which is way too much. And I will say you're definitely better off with something like a Xeon E3 1240 V2 if you're going to go with socket 1155. For the motherboard, I picked up this Asus P8H61i Mini-ITX socket 1155 motherboard for 25 bucks. And this thing caused me a ton of headaches. When I first got it, it would turn on fine, but then after I disabled the compatibility support module, or CSM, it started acting super strange. It started having issues posting, then it wouldn't detect any of my SATA drives, just all around being super weird. I first thought that the RAM was bad, but it would do the same thing even after switching out the RAM. I messed around with it all evening, and eventually after I flashed the most recent BIOS, the board started working without issues. So learn from my mistakes. I guess if anyone else also has motherboard issues, just make sure your BIOS is up to date. Next is RAM. 2 8GB sticks of Goodram DDR3 at 1600 MHz. I got this kit from the guy who sold me the motherboard. I basically got it just to save on shipping, and it cost me 15 bucks. And honestly, saying that out loud is kind of painful because you really shouldn't be paying this kind of money for these ancient potatoes. The only way this old hardware is worth it is if you pick it up in a complete office computer for super cheap, and then you put some kind of low power graphics card in it. Building a computer like this from scratch, like I'm doing, is a really terrible idea. Alright, onto the CPU cooler. You would think that I would have learned my lesson from trying to cool this processor with an Intel cooler, but here I am again. But this time it's a deluxe ultra premium Intel cooler with a copper center. I think I'm getting my hopes up a little too much with this thing. I read a bunch of Reddit posts about how this thing can cool 95 watt chips, and it's actually like 9 or 5 degrees cooler than the stock aluminum one, and that pretty much sold me on this thing. I was also really just curious if it would actually perform as well as people claimed it would, and it ended up costing me about 4 bucks. I do think that this cooler, as well as the design of the case, will help keep the processor temperatures in check and it'll do better than my previous build. For the storage, I've got this weird little 400 gigabyte Dell SSD for 20 bucks. As you can probably tell, it's smaller than a regular SSD. It's actually a 1.8 inch drive rather than the usual 2.5. It also has a Micro-SATA connector, which is different than the regular SATA one, so you have to hook it up through an adapter. But otherwise it works just like regular. Although when I first picked it up, it was behaving pretty weird. It was displaying only as a 120 gigabyte drive, which made me think maybe I got scammed. And when I tried to install Windows on it, the installation would fail. I tried to format it and plug it into different computers, but the issue persisted. Eventually my friend saved me. He told me to go into DiskPart and clean the disk, which basically solved everything. It's kind of funny that in this video I've already had 2 issues that were solved quite easily. It makes me wonder how often stuff is written off as being broken, just because there are some strange, weird issues like this, even though the hardware itself is perfectly functional. Alright, I'm actually pretty excited about the power supply. I've got this Dell Electronics DPS-250AB-24 A Flex power supply. It's rated for a 250 watt. And man, oh man, this is a really nice power supply, especially for the $20 that I bought it for. This power supply is super quiet, which is quite a rarity for this form factor. Usually the tiny fan sounds like a jet turbine when the thing is under load, and many people end up swapping out the stock fans for Hawk Tuah fans. But this one is very quiet. Maybe this has something to do with the fan being larger than the usual 40mm flex fans. As you can see, it's a little chunkier. On top of being quiet, the power supply also runs very cool. It's rated for 200 watt on the 12 volt line, and even under a sustained load of 150 watt, this thing is just barely warm, which is really awesome. Looking inside this thing, all the capacitors are of the 105 Celsius high temperature variety, and I don't recognize the make of these capacitors. Maybe someone else knows. Also, for those of you who haven't heard of Delta Electronics before, just know that they're a very reliable brand, and many companies use them as their OEM when it comes to power supplies, pretty much like Seasonic or FSP. So, I have saved the best for last, the grand reveal of the graphics card. And once again, I'm going with the GTX 1050 Ti, this time from Gainward, which has a really awesome looking design that looks very weird and retro. I feel like if you put a sticker of a video game character on it, you could mistake this thing for a graphics card from the 2000s. I know I had a 1050 Ti in the previous video as well, but I really just love this card. Although I promise to use something new in the next build. But this card is just really great. It runs very cool. There's no need for a PCIe cable. All the power just comes from the motherboard slot, and the 4 gigs of VRAM is enough to get you into the playable range for even a lot of newer games. Well, at least if you're content with playing at 30 FPS. But as far as older and less demanding games go, this thing is a certified beast. Now for the case. I am of course going to be 3D printing a case for this build, and this time I decided to be a little ambitious. I recently got gifted a riser cable from a friend, and since I also have this nice flex power supply, I'm going to be making a very stylish and trendy design that's popular with all the hip 3D printed case enthusiasts. The sandwich style case. I always thought that the sandwich style cases were very cool. That sort of layout is pretty much the best way to make use of as little room as possible and still have a fairly powerful build with a full height 2-slot graphics card. It's also one of the best designs for keeping thermals in check, which I think will be perfect for all the components that I've got today. Of course, I am going to be doing things a little differently than most of these designs, just because I'm so unique and cool. Most of these cases will have a cooler height of around 40 millimeters, but my case is going to allow for a cooler height of around 70 millimeters. And yes, I just did this so I can fit my Intel cooler in here, but actually it's a good idea overall, just because now you can put an absolutely massive cooler in here. Even something like an ID Cooling IS67XT, which would be enough to cool a really hot CPU. So if you really wanted to, you could shove a 9800 X3D in here and get away with it. The observant of you might have noticed that I'm also using a 90-degree riser cable instead of the usual double reverse riser that you would use in a sandwich style case. I designed this case so you have a little bit more room to put any kind of riser you want in here and have it fit, since usually sandwich style cases will not work with the kind of cable I have. This and the taller CPU cooler ended up resulting in the case turning out to be about 6 liters in volume, which is still pretty small, but it is about a liter bigger than the smallest versions of these cases. Overall, I'm super happy with how this case and this computer turned out, and I'm very proud of this design. The only thing that's super janky about this build is I was too lazy to model a custom bracket for the tiny SSD I have, so I literally just hot glued it onto the 2.5-inch bracket that I have. But other than that, I'd say everything went really well. By the way, here's a little fun fact. Since I live in Ukraine, we're pretty much regularly dealing with blackouts since our neighbor likes to turn our power grid into scrap metal. As you might expect, this is not the best if you want to 3D print stuff. Luckily, I was able to save up some money from the allowance that my girlfriend gives me, and I put together this little UPS setup. Here's the actual UPS, which supports a 500 watt nominal load and a 800 watt peak load. For the batteries, I've got 3 33 amp hour AGM batteries. These are lead acid batteries, but they are safe for indoor use. This setup pretty much lets me print for around 5 hours or so without power, which was a huge lifesaver, because this past winter we had a lot of days when the power was off for longer than it was on. Really great purchase. On that positive note, let's try out some games. And I will begin by profusely apologizing. I once again didn't try any emulators, but I promise I will next time, for sure. I did, however, download some new games to try out, and as you can probably tell, the first game on the list is God of War. I haven't actually played this game, or really any of the God of War games, but this looks amazing. I'm definitely going to do a full playthrough of this game eventually, running at 1080p, with FSR upscaling of course, low preset, and I gotta say this game looks great and it's surprisingly running very well, especially considering the hardware. I obviously don't know if there are more hardware intensive parts later on in the game, but right now everything feels great. Smooth frame time graph, and we're sitting at around 50 FPS, which I think is very playable. Taking a look at the CPU temperature, I do think that the copper cooler and this case design is treating this processor a lot better than in my previous build. This game runs the CPU at around 60 watts, and in my last build the processor was going up over 80 degrees at the same wattage. So I think we're doing a lot better now. Next up is my beloved Elden Ring. 1080p medium preset, and I gotta say, this really doesn't feel good. We are very CPU bottlenecked here. I tried to set the graphics settings higher than I usually would on this graphics card, just to try and cut down on how much work the CPU has to do, but it really doesn't help. The frame time might look alright, but the gameplay feels like I'm wading through a never-ending swamp level. If this was some kind of story game, I would actually consider this fine, but since this is a game that heavily focuses on combat, I'll say this feels pretty bad, and I wouldn't recommend playing it like this. Although, admittedly, I did actually play through this whole thing on a much worse system than this. So if you're really determined, then I don't think old hardware is going to stop you. Next up is another game that's right on the edge of being playable. Spider-Man Miles Morales. This is another game that I haven't actually played, but I really want to. I haven't really kept up to date on the Spider-Man movies after watching the Tobey Maguire movies as a kid, but I recently watched the 2 Spider-Verse movies, and it made me want to check out the Spider-Man games. Especially since so many tech YouTubers have these games in their benchmarks, and watching Spider-Man swing around through the city always looks very satisfying. I do think this game is a lot more playable than Elden Ring, especially since the combat feels a fair bit less punishing, and so you don't really need to have a supercomputer to give you an advantage. The game here is running at 720p, low settings, and it's doing pretty okay. The CPU especially seems to have exceeded expectations here, and we seem to be just mostly GPU limited. Which to me is fine since you can just always play on potato quality, but the gameplay itself feels responsive and I didn't notice any stutter, which was cool. Now on to good old Fallout 4. Just like my previous build, I'll say that this is where these budget computers will really shine. The game is 1080p, either medium or high settings, I don't remember, but the game looks and feels really great. I'm just running around having a grand old time as the nukes are coming in to wipe out everyone I know and love. If you haven't played this game before, I highly recommend it. I will say that this initial part of the game feels like a chore to get through, but once the game gets going, it's super fun, especially in survival mode. So if you tried this and dropped it when you were going through that first area, then I say you should give it another try. And for our last game, we have another very playable title, Witcher 3. The old version, of course, without the next-gen update, 1080p medium settings, and the game is running good. This system would definitely benefit from a more powerful CPU. Even on this socket, there are things like the i7-3770 or a Xeon equivalent that would be a bit better and would run at a lower wattage. But this i7-2600 still does a decent job with this game. I did play a tiny bit more after recording this because I was curious how it would go, and the performance is stable even when you're riding around through different areas or fighting the pack of ghouls right after this initial tutorial area. So just like Fallout 4, if you haven't played this, then I highly recommend it, especially if you're gaming on a potato and looking for something that will run on your system. Alright, that's going to be all the games for today. Also, the channel isn't monetized and I haven't made a Patreon or anything. But if you feel like supporting me, I've got my PayPal in the description of the video. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed. And I've got a few more videos I'm working on. The next one is actually going to be a build of my own personal computer that I use and the case that I designed for it, which was quite the challenge given the design I chose and the parts that I have, but it was definitely a lot of fun putting everything together. Anyway, that's it for today, and I'll see you guys next time.